Well, good morning, everyone. I am Kim Johnson, and I am a member at Kirkwood UCC here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have served on our annual meeting planning committee for this year. And my pronouns are she, her. And I am serving as your tech host this morning. And we are so delighted to be joined today by Joe Engel, and I want to introduce him to you all this morning. But we're so glad that you all are here for annual meeting, and I hope your weekend is going great. If you have any questions, especially on the tech end, feel free to send me a direct message, or just post it in the open chat. If I can help you in any way, just please let me know. So this morning, Reverend Joseph Engel is our leader, and he is a UCC minister who, in his senior year in seminary, visited prisoners at the Bronx House of Detention, and his world was changed. He began working against the death penalty, working with the condemned in all southern states, and the abolition of the death penalty, as well as opposing mass incarceration. Joe is the author of Slouching Toward Tyranny, Mass Incarceration, Death Sentences, and Racism, which can be ordered through Amazon. And I will turn it over to you now, Joe. Thank you this morning.
Thank you, Kim, and it's great to see everyone. I assume we were all scattered about the South somewhere, so it's good to have you. As Kim mentioned, I was in seminary in New York at Union Theological Seminary, living and working in East Harlem. When I went up to the Bronx House of Detention my senior year of seminary, because Attica had happened, and that was a prison rebellion. And I just watched it on my fuzzy black and white TV in my tenement apartment and realized, well, here I am, last year of seminary. I've never been in a prison or jail. And 10% of what these prisoners are talking about is true about the way they're being treated, I'd be upset too. So I arranged to visit the Bronx House of Detention to experience what it was like to visit prisoners, because it's what Jesus said to do. But I'd never done it. So that year changed me tremendously. I didn't do a lot for those men. I showed up every week and I visited with them. I had no money. I had no contacts. I was simply a student and being there with them. But they taught me a lot. And that's where I first learned about mass incarceration, because the men I visited at the Bronx House of Detention, 44 of them on that cell block, everyone was either African American or Puerto Rican except for one white guy. They were all there pending some charge, not because they were guilty. It was a jail. And at that point, people were not serving time in jails. So they were awaiting trial. And average length of stay for your trial was 18 months. So think about that. You're there with a charge, which could very well not be true, but you're going to spend 18 months of your life awaiting trial because you're poor and can't post bond. So I learned a lot from those guys. And one of the things I learned at Union, which when I was there, there were still stories circulating about Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a theologian at Union, who retired before I arrived. And I thought I'd share one of them with you. Well, actually, I'm going to share two of them with you. But the first one, in Niebuhr's ethics class, you have to realize Niebuhr was kind of a gruff guy. He came from a labor parish in Detroit. So he'd seen a lot. And so one of his students raised his hand one day and asked Dr. Niebuhr, he said, well, Dr. Niebuhr, you know, the Apostle Paul talks about us being willing to be a fool for Christ's sake. Do you think that's what we should be, fool for Christ's sake? Niebuhr looked at the student and said, well, I suppose it's all right to be a fool. Just make sure you're not a damn fool. And that sort of sums up Niebuhr's realistic version of things. And when I apply that to my own work with prisoners, it's either one or the other. I'm not sure which one. You can make your own guess as we go along here, but it's certainly one or the other. The second story about Niebuhr is he loved to talk about how you did theology. And this is what Niebuhr did in his ethics class. He would hold up the Bible with one hand and he'd say, "This is how you do theology. You know your scripture." And with the other one, he held up a newspaper. Or in our day, we may hold up an iPad like I'm doing here. But the point is the same. You're integrating the scripture with the information you receive from the culture. At this point, let me return my iPad to my wife so she can use it for bridge, and I'll be right back. There you go, honey. So as we think about Niebuhr and mass incarceration in Jesus, I'm reminded of the theological rival he had at the time, Karl Barth. And Barth always said that the first confessing church did not come through Pentecost. It came at Calvary. It was those two thieves crucified with Jesus. And one of them recognized who he was. And that's where the church began. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And our problem in the church is we seem to have forgotten that. We've forgotten about the people who are in prison or jail. We have 2.2 million of them in our country. We over-incarcerate by far more than anybody in the world. And the reason we do that is not because we have a crime problem. It's because we have laws that have been passed. And I saw a lot of this in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Laws that were passed that had an inequitable effect, especially on African Americans and on poor people. And that's why we have 2.2 million people incarcerated. Now, many of those people could be out today, frankly. This past September, I began working with a man again who I had met in 1985 on Tennessee's death row, Rocky Coker. And Rocky, and I should explain that we set up a visitation program here for people on death row in 1975. And as part of that program, we match people in congregations with a person on death row, and they visit. These are contact visits at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison here in Nashville. And so I had met Rocky on death row, and in the 10 years I knew him there, from 85 really to 96, I found a man who was a very able litigator, a man who stopped several executions on his own, because at that point we had no lawyers for these guys. We were begging lawyers to take these cases, and there were no funded state or federal funded agencies to help at that time. And by his own legal skill, he had his sentence reduced to life. And he paroled out this past September after 36 years in prison. And so I've been working with Rocky since then. And as he says, you know, it's Joe, it's like I'm coming out of a cave after 36 years. And it's really true. I mean, little things you take for granted, like when we say link, you know, you immediately think of the computer link. When you said link to Rocky, when he first came out, he thought of a link on a chain. Got no computers in prison. Yeah, so his familiarity with the word link meant chain. So what I'm using Rocky as an example, it's not that Rocky's a bad person. He did commit a murder, but it's not like Rocky is someone who cannot be a productive citizen. And he is on his way to being a productive citizen. I have an interview with him at a major law firm here at the end of the month, where hopefully he's going to be hired as a paralegal. And I think that's what Jesus saw way back then. And when you look at those scriptures, it's very interesting. When you read the scriptures about prisons and prisoners, there's no doubt about which side of the equation Jesus and God is on. There's talk about freeing the captives. There's talk about visiting the prisoners. And then in the Psalms, you get talk about prisoners as well. And you think about the people who we know in scripture who are in prison or who were executed. Let's see, we got Peter, we got Paul, we got, well, and also we have the murderers like Moses. We got Jesus. We got Stephen. He was stoned. So you can see we belong to a faith that was founded by people who were outlaws in one sense or another. You know, they were very much opposed to the Roman state because when the New Testament was written, the Roman state decreed that Caesar was the emperor, and the emperor was God. And if you said otherwise, you would be executed. So that's why you have a lot of these martyr stories early on in Christianity. And by the way, all these martyr stories are about poor people who believed in Jesus and kept confessing him despite the threat of death and ultimately lost their lives. That's why you have all these stories that are tremendously popular in the early days of Christianity, because they were plugged into the truth about the gospel, which was that it liberates you to be over and against whatever earthly forces there are. Over and against them. You're freed. You know, Jesus frees you from that. You're free to speak and act in love, forgiveness, and reconciliation, which is not the way of this world, as we all know. So as I think about my visits with my friends on death row since '75 across the South, some of them, Kim, in your fair state of Georgia, and every other southern state. I'm not sure where all my colleagues are from here, but I have visited your death row if you're from the South. As I think about these folks, I am reminded of the fact how much they have enriched my life, and how I don't even talk about ministering to them, because that's not what I'm doing. I'm just being there. If there's any ministering going on, it's usually the other way around. They're concerned about my health and my family and my well-being. And it seems to me that's the power of what Jesus talks about. When you go into a prison or a jail, then you have a natural expectation of fear, because it's the unknown, and you watch TV and you've seen all these horrible things. It's like when I was at the Bronx House of Detention for the first time. I'd gone through my little chaplain orientation. I had my badge on, rode the elevator up to the 6th floor, got off. The guard met me, let me in. And all of a sudden, that's my first time in a prison or jail. I'm looking at this enormous cage. And in the cage are human beings in individual cells. And the guard walks me across the top of the cell block. It's called the top of the walk. And we get to the corner where the door is that leads inside the cell block. And the guard said, well, clergy and lawyers visit over here in this room. So I'm a naive seminarian, what the heck. I said, why don't you let me in here with these guys? That guard looked at me, shook his head, shrugged, opened the door, and I stepped into the cell block. And as I looked down at those individual cells, I'd assumed all those doors were closed and I would just go to cell to cell. And then I realized as he slammed the door behind me, and he slammed that door, all those doors are open. So I'm standing there with all the prisoners. I have access to them, they have access to me. And when he slammed that door, this is what I thought. Oh my God, he's locked me in here with these animals. And that's what we're socialized to think. That's just like drinking water. You get that out of our culture. You're taught that somehow people in prison are less than who we are. And I had no sooner had that thought and had that experience than the guy in the first bunk looked up at me and said, man, what are you doing in here? And I laughed. And he said, he invited me to sit down in his bunk and we talked. And so then after talking for a while, he took me down to everybody on the walk, and I met everybody in the cell block. And I spent the year visiting these men. That totally changed my life. And so when I came back south, which I always wanted to do since I was native of North Carolina, I came here to Nashville and worked with a guy named Will Campbell. And we started something called Southern Prison Ministry, then the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons. And that's what took me into Southern prisons and jails for many, many years. So to me, it's all of one piece. That first visit, which after the visit, I went back and read those scriptures in the Bible. I thought I knew what they meant, but I realized I didn't, because I hadn't read them from the bottom up. That's how you read these scriptures. You read them from the people who are on the bottom looking up, and you see the revolutionary gospel that we have. I mean, when Jesus went into Nazareth in his inaugural sermon and preached freedom to the captives, that's what he was talking about. Restoring sight to the blind. This is a message that was preaching the coming of the kingdom of God in the steps of John the Baptist. And that's who we are. That's who we're supposed to follow. We're supposed to follow in those steps of discipleship. And we're doing it in an age of mass incarceration with 2.2 million people locked up in the United States of America. You know, a lot of people are happy and relieved that our current president's in office and some decency and competence has been returned to the White House. But if you look around at the criminal justice scene, it's pretty much the same. We still have 2.2 million people locked up. We still have state legislators passing laws like crazy to make it even worse. And we have a death penalty that is vigorously enforced in the South. And the South, as always, you know, we led the country in slavery. We led the country in religious revivals. We led the country in segregation. We led the country in more religious revivals. And now we lead the country in mass incarceration. And we're still having religious revivals. So we're the most religious and the most punitive part of the country. Go figure. These are supposedly Christians, followers of the man who talked about forgiveness, love, and reconciliation. So our challenge is really significant. And I think the best way to go about it is to read those scriptures and to find some way to access your local jail or prison. And in our visitation program here, we do an orientation out at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. We explain all the procedures of visitation. We match the visitors up, and they are able to write their prisoner while the process of getting your registration approval to visit the prisoner is going on, which can take two weeks at least. And so through those letters, you get to know the prisoner, and then we arrange it for the first visit and make sure the person is accompanied by someone who's visited before, so that it's not too alien. So now we have over 30 visitors. Over the years, we've had over 95 visitors. You know, people move on, people get executed. But it's a really powerful and valuable program in the fact that people are coming together and meeting one-on-one, which I think is the heart of the gospel. And that's what our televangelists seem to have forgotten, is that, you know, what we want to do is do what the heart of the gospel says, which is one-on-one as much as possible. And speaking of one-on-one, my dog is knocking at the door, so I'm going to have to open the door and let the dog in so she can be with me. Hang on. You got her? My wife got her. Thank you. So there's a lot we can talk about, but what I really want to do is engage you all in conversation. because, and I would like to, if we could, Kim, go around and everybody say who they are, where they are, and what their interest in this, and then we can get a little conversation going.
Great, sure. If folks will just take their self off of mute, I think it's where you can do that for yourself. Yes, so great. We'll start with you, Linda, since you were able to.
Okay, I am Linda Bryant. I'm from Kirkwood, UCC in Atlanta. And I have interest in this subject that is both familial and people in my family having spent time in jails and prisons. Also, as a feminist, I'm very interested. And as an activist who is looking at abolition of the prison industrial complex from a feminist point of view, I want to know more. And as a Christian, I want to be faithful. And as an older person, I want to see how I fit into all of that at this stage in my life.
Thanks, Linda. Is Julie, I see you and Dan are off mute, so I'll ask y'all to go next.
I'm Julie Binney. I'm from Kirkwood United Church of Christ as well in Atlanta. And
I'm Dan Binney.
and we're here because we started corresponding with a man who was on death row about 10 or 11 years ago. And we went through the whole process with him. He ended up, he had lawyers working with him from Virginia. He's in jail, or he's in prison in the system in Georgia. And he did get taken off death row, and he now has life without parole. So we visit him. He's at Telfair State Prison, which is kind of towards Savannah from Atlanta. And we visit him, write to him, send him food boxes, that sort of thing. We're his buddies, but he really has very few other people. And so we, having been visitors, and I was also in the Kairos prison ministry for several years at a women's prison in Georgia. So I think having the experience that we do, I was just really interested to hear what you were going to say today. So I think it's, and made me figure out some other ways that we can become active.
Janice, it looks like you're ready to go.
Okay. I'm Jan Ginter. I'm from Crossville, Tennessee at a UCC/Presbyterian church here. I don't have any great story to tell. I'm just thought that the seminar sounded interesting, so I signed up for it.
Thank you. We're glad you're here. Who else? Nancy.
Thank you. I'm Nancy Sales, live in Birmingham, and share all kinds of things with First Congregational UCC in Birmingham and with Beloved Community UCC in Birmingham. I have spent many years as a volunteer tutoring at a men's shelter, Firehouse Ministries men's shelter, that followed on having the opportunity to have been employed in adult basic education in Birmingham. And so I guess my closest current contact is at the shelter with persons who have been incarcerated. And one of the staff there is one of the organizers for a group called basically it's those who have graduated out of incarceration. But it just continues to come up in other discussions and Bible study and in both of the congregations, and I'm a part of a small group that does vigil when there is there's been scheduled a death of someone on death row in that is on the day of that execution in Alabama. And that's been a very moving experience for me, just to hear the testimony of those who have visited with the persons who are being executed by the state.
Nancy, we have a couple of other people in the room. I'm not sure if you're able to come off of mute to say hello to us this morning. Edna or Elliot or William.
Yes, my name is Bill Reynolds. I'm with Spirit of the Cross Church in Huntsville, Alabama. And I am interested because the state of Alabama is being sued by the Federal Department of Justice for the inhumane conditions in men's prisons particularly. And I want to know what the UCC stance is, or hear something from the UCC about what can be done about the conditions in prisons.
Hey, I'm Elliot. I'm also from Kirkwood United Church of Christ in Atlanta. And for the past few months, I've been corresponding with two men who are serving lengthy prison sentences. And yeah, it's really kind of changed my perspective on a lot of that, and wanted to kind of see it from a theological perspective too.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. And again, I'm Kim, and I'm not sure if everyone was present. I am at Kirkwood here in Atlanta. And I got to talk with Joe for a moment before we started and found our connections. My partner, Jennifer, and I went to seminary in Memphis. And one of our professors there taught us a lot about incarceration and the death penalty and also homelessness. And I'm just really interested in more. And we've been in Atlanta for about 10 years. And a short while that we've been here, we volunteered at a place of hospitality for folks experiencing homelessness. And they also did a lot of visits to the prison, to death row. And Jennifer, as my partner, and I spent time going to the vigils here, and we went to the ones at the Capitol during the executions. Sounds like, Nancy, what you were describing there in Birmingham. And those were some very powerful. We started, I think the first vigil we went to, maybe the second, was for Kelly Gissendenner. It was one of the few female people that has been executed, and her story was just life-changing, and that she could not her life had been drastically changed. If you've not heard about her, maybe Google her, but her life was just, she changed so much in prison, and the state still executed her. And so, Joe, as you've been talking, I've just been thinking about her and reflecting on her life and death. And I just want to change the world, but I just look forward. I've really enjoyed what you've said so far, and I'm glad that we're here together this morning.
So since you mentioned Kelly, I had the honor of being on a panel with Kelly's daughter at the American Academy of Religion, which happened to be meeting in Atlanta a month before Kelly's scheduled execution. And hearing that young woman speak about how the state of Georgia was determined to create another victim by killing her mother, making her a family member who's lost someone to murder, was one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. So if any of you are in the Atlanta area and can access her and have her come talk to your congregation, it is incredibly powerful. She's a very strong, able, and loving person whose life has been maimed forever by the state of Georgia when they executed her mother. So you mentioned that, I just immediately thought of that. And I want to go, is it William Reynolds or Bill? What's the way we go here with your name?
I go by Bill.
Okay, Bill. Well, it so happens I'm married to a woman who grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. So I know Huntsville well, and unfortunately, I know the Alabama prison. So what has happened in Alabama is in the 70s, Federal District Court Judge Frank Johnson was a superb jurist. And he declared the entire Alabama prison system unconstitutional, set down some things that they had to do. Now, of course, you know all too well that the legislature in Alabama doesn't want to really do much for anything for prisoners. So they still had to do something to meet those court orders. But like all court orders, they expired. And what happened? The Alabama prison system went back to hell is what it did. And that's exactly where it is. And believe me, federal intervention is really needed there. So I'm happy to see it happening. I'm also realistic in giving past experience, knowing that if you don't stay on this and intervene forcefully and monitor what goes on, it all lapses back. So it's a tough situation. But the people you should be in touch with, my friend Brian Stevenson's down at Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. Brian and EJI are doing great work in Alabama. You should talk to them about your concern. You can Google them and just get in touch with them, and they will hook you up and help you understand what you and your congregation or whoever would like to do about prisons in Alabama. They're a terrific resource, so I'd encourage you to do that.
Thank you.
Now, was there another question that was out there that I neglected to respond to? You know, when I think about the arc of my own work here, I have just come out, well, I'm not out, I'm still in trauma therapy for 2.5 years. And it's just the accumulation of losing so many people I've been close to the executioner finally drove me to the breaking point with Ed Zagorski's execution here in Tennessee on, would you believe it or not, All Saints Day, November 1st, 2018. So I did 2 death watches with Ed in 15 days, which if I'd stepped back from the situation, I'd realize nobody should do 2 death watches in 15 days. The first one, the execution was stopped 45 minutes before he was to be electrocuted. And the reason was they weren't sure the electric chair would work. Nobody was concerned about Ed. So the governor issued a stay, and then they rescheduled it for November 1st. And we went through that death watch again. So death watch in Tennessee, you are moved to the holding area near the execution chamber 72 hours before you're to be killed. And so as clergy, I visited Ed there, and I visited other men there up to the end. And it's, as you can imagine, it's being in an emotional vice that's being cranked shut, you know, just as the minutes go down, you know, it's closer and closer and closer. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. And you know, it's a gift to be with someone under those circumstances, that they would share their life with you to the very end and request that you be there. But it's a painful gift because these are people you have worked with and love and care about. And you're watching them as the minutes of their life pass away, not because of some illness, but because of the state's determination to exterminate them. And Ed was on death row for 35 years, longer than anybody else at that time. He was what we call a straight up guy. All the other guys loved him. He helped people out when he could, minded his own business. He's the only guy on death row I know who never got a write-up in 35 years. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. How you can spend 35 years on death row and never get written up once for some petty something is incredible. So he had all these great grounds for clemency, which of course was denied by a Republican governor, who is, quote, a Christian governor, of course, and has now been succeeded by another, quote, Christian governor. And these guys are executing people left and right. And so as we did that first death watch, it was really intense because we had, at that point, we had 62 guys on death row and one woman in women's prison. Now we have 52, I think, between executions and cases being overturned. We're down to 52. But these are people who've been here for years. And because of a lawsuit we brought years ago, we have programs for them. Not only we have a visitation program, we have college classes they can take, we have high school classes they can take, they take mediation classes. They have incredible opportunities. We've had the Catholic and Episcopal bishop both come to death row. We've had one of the prisoners confirmed in the Episcopal Church on death row. We had another one baptized into the Baptist ministry on death row. So it's like a real community. People know each other. We know our strengths and weaknesses. We've known each other for years. And people really care for each other. So when you get into the end of time, when somebody you've worked with and known for all these years is about to be killed by the state, it is a terrific cost to everyone involved. And as we got down to the end on that first death watch with Ed, and I'd been coming out every week all during the summer. So the first death watch was in October. I've been coming out every week during the summer to fully understand his story, his personal story, because I knew Ed as a prisoner. I didn't know him, what he did before he came to prison. And so he filled me in on his life week after week, and we became very, very close all that summer leading into the fall. And so when they moved him to death watch in October for the first time, I felt like I knew the man I was visiting and that I could be present with him. And went in for that first visit, and 2-hour visit, 3 to 5 in the afternoon. Good visit. Covered a lot of the things Ed wanted to talk about. Came back the next day. Another good visit. And then, of course, the final visit was the third day. And there we were with time counting down. And I'm in a booth. And there's a barrier between us that you can see through. There's glass, and he's on the other side of it. And all of a sudden, that door behind me unlocks 45 minutes before the execution. The guard tells me my visit's over. I said, what? I said, I'm his clergy. You can't stop my visit. He said, the warden says the visit's over. So they got me out of there, and no one would tell me what was going on until I got out in the parking lot and I hailed somebody with the press that said, what's going on? They said the governor had issued a stay of execution because they were worried the electric chair wouldn't work. Ed had elected for electrocution rather than lethal injection, because lethal injection is probably the worst method of execution we have. It's incredible. It's like a chemical burning. But the DOC weren't sure they had the electric chair tuned up good enough. So the governor issued a stay. So I came back to a regular visit with Ed back on death row the next week. Had our regular visit, sitting in a little room, just talking about all sorts of things. And then the next time I saw him was back on death watch again. And when I came in for that first visit of the 3 visits on death watch, and I sat down across from him, he put his hand up and I put my hand up and on the glass, and he said, deja vu. And I said, yeah, deja vu. But we knew it wasn't going to be deja vu because there wasn't going to be the same ending this time. And we talked a lot about his family. And he'd been doing a lot of push-ups. He's in incredible shape, just that helped him pass the time. And he teased the guard because the guard couldn't do nearly as many push-ups as he did. And got to the second day's visit. And he talked a lot about Laurie, who was his girlfriend way back in the day. His life reached a crossroads with this woman named Laurie, whom he really cared for, and she really cared for him. But Ed was an outlaw, not in any, he had a steady job, but he was an outlaw. He dealt in marijuana. He was a soldier in a major drug operation, a marijuana dealership out of Louisiana, which moved up to Tennessee, which is what got him in all this trouble. But he and Laurie really cared for each other, but he realized, in addition to loving Laurie, he loved his lifestyle. And part of his lifestyle was his Harley. He would ride his Harley. Went out to Sturgis, Nebraska every summer for the big motorcycle rally. And he said, Joe, back then it was the real bikers. It wasn't the lawyers and the doctors who buy Harleys now. Back then it was real bikers. We had real rallies back then. He laughed. He had a great sense of humor. So we talked about that and talked about Laurie, and then I came back for the third day, the final day. And so I came in, and you go to, when you're driving to the prison, it's a 20-minute drive from my house to the prison. It's not far at all, just across the river. When you're coming to a final visit, you're always trying to anticipate what might be asked and how you might respond. Because nothing you're going to do is adequate. You just want to be there, but you want to try to do the best you can. So I got in there with Ed, and it became the craziest death watch I've ever done. I get in there and he's smiling. And I looked at him and I said, what's up? He said, well, I've always told you what I thought the afterlife was going to be. I said, yeah, I remember. He said, it's going to be women, none over 20, all wearing bikinis. And I've got a motorcycle and there are no cops. That was Ed's imagination of the afterlife. I said, yeah, I remember that. Then he looked at me seriously and said, last night, I think I had an experience of what the afterlife is really going to be like. I said, what happened? He said, well, I was dreaming. I had a dream. I was sound asleep and I had this dream, and Laurie came to me. And she put out her hand. And so I held her hand, and we're on this grassy knoll. And all of a sudden, we lifted up into the air. We were flying. I couldn't believe it. And we turned and took off. And we headed right through head toward a forest. And I was thinking, we're going to crash into these trees. But we went right through them all the way to the other side and landed on the grass over there. Now, grass is significant because if you're on death row, you never touch grass. You're always on concrete. And in his dream, he's actually touching grass. And they landed, and she looked at him and said, everything will be all right. That's what Ed Zagorski took with him to the electric chair. Now, the rest of that visit was chaotic because Ed asked me to do some things which were virtually impossible to do, but I said I would try to do them. There had been some people who had kidnapped and killed several people, trying to put the blame on the person who actually killed the victim. Ed Zagorski was convicted of killing but didn't kill. So these were friends of his who were trying to get the evidence on this other guy by killing some people and planting some of his stuff there, but the cops never found the bodies. So Ed wanted those bodies to be identified so the victims could get closure, and he was telling me about where he thought that information was. And I said, well, you know, Ed, the first thing they're going to ask me is, who are these guys that killed them? He said, well, we're not in the crime solving business. We're trying to help the victims' families here. So those guys are my age now, 65. They don't need to be in prison. Prison's the worst place anybody could be. Just get this information, because I want those victims to have closure if they can, those families. So I said, okay. So I left Death Watch, talked to the guard. He said, this is above my pay scale. Sent me up front, talked to the shift commander, who told him exactly what to tell the warden, and I went back to Ed, told him what was going on. And he said, okay, that sounds good. Because we needed to get the FBI there so Ed could give them all the TBI there so Ed could give them all the details, either that or the prosecutor, Ray Whitley. So that was my request to the warden, to the commissioners, to get them there. And we went on with our visit, talked about Laurie, and time was up. I'd spent a lot of time trying to negotiate all this stuff for Ed. And we put our hands up, said, I love you, had a final prayer, and I walked out. As his lawyer was coming in, Kelly Henry. So I hugged Kelly and said, look, Kelly, this is the deal. Could be the TBI is going to show up here to talk to Ed so he can give him the information on these victims. So just be prepared, because I know this is your last visit, but you may be interrupted. And I walked out of Death Watch. And there was a warden coming down with his retinue of people. So I stopped the warden. I said, did you get my message? He said, yeah, I replied to all of them. I said, no, not the emails, but the message I sent you in the last hour about Ed. He said, yes, I got it. And I passed it on to the commissioner. I said, okay, good. I've done all I can do. And I left. And they killed Ed. They walked him to the electric chair. And his final words are, let's rock. And he meant he wanted to get through this so he could be with Laurie. Because that was his vision, that he was going to be with Laurie on the other side of this. And he wanted to be done with all this. And when I came out of there, I don't know if it was the 40 years of doing this. I don't know if it was 2 death watches. But I was emotionally wasted. And have spent almost, the last 2 years and plus in trauma therapy with a very good trauma therapist, trying to put the pieces of my life back together. So I think it's really important to realize when we get involved in these situations, hopefully they're never as extreme as what I just described. But we are getting involved with people's lives. And there are pains and there are sorrows and there are joys But when you work with people in prison, the thing that strikes you is your common humanity, that we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. That's the thing that hits you. And after a while, you're thinking, why are these people in here? Because in reality, most of them could be out on the streets right now. So I just wanted to share that with you, give you perspective about it, and open it up for any more questions.
I wonder if you have any thoughts or suggestions on what we as individual, or especially what we as congregations can or should be doing right now. I mean, that's a super broad question, but
Well, actually, some of you are already doing it. I mean, wherever you live, there's a jail or a prison. We're talking about the southern part of the United States of America. So get access. There are ways of getting access to these facilities, and visit the people in those facilities. Sometimes you may have to shop around before you can find one that you're comfortable with and that will actually let you in, because you got to realize the bottom line here is the people running these facilities don't want you in there. Now, by law, they can't keep you out. But by and large, they don't want you in there because they want prisons are all about control. So the maximized control, keep people out, the more control you have. So visitation can be an uphill process of trying to get in. So prepare yourself for that. But that's the first thing. And I think that's what Jesus was really after when he told us to visit those in prison. Because what he meant by this, back in probably when I went up to the Bronx House of Detention for the first time, I thought, oh yeah, well, I'm going to go visit people in prison because Jesus told me to visit people in prison because that's what a Christian does. Well, that's only the tip of the iceberg. What Jesus really meant is you visit people in prison because what the prisoners do for you. That's the dynamic here. That's the real dynamic. It's not what you're doing for somebody, it's what the prisoners are doing for you. And what you find is you are open up to a world that you don't know much about as you get to know them, and you learn a lot. Brian Stevenson's fond of talking about proximity. He says it's important to be proximate to people so you can understand what's going on. And he's exactly right. And when you visit people in jail or a prison, you're getting proximate to them. Now, it's not going to be easy. I don't want anybody to think that. It has challenges. But that's part of the equation that you sign up for. So there you are in Atlanta. I am sure there are people engaged in some form of prison and jail ministry in Atlanta that you could talk to and figure out a way to get you and others in your congregation involved.
Joe, this is Nancy.
Yeah.
I have a question and something I didn't share earlier. Question is, and it comes partly from, there's a very small peace vigil group, and one of those is currently active in it. This is a once a week, and he noted last week that he'd received word that the I think from the chaplain at West Jefferson State Prison, Alabama State Prison, was to be reopening to volunteers.
Mm.
And he had been a volunteer for many years. I think first a part of one of the quarterly programs, but since that, or maybe even before that, just to visit. And I said, "Can you just do it to visit?" And he said, "Well, it's supposed to be, he's supposed to be teaching something." And I'm not sure if he said what it is he's supposed to be teaching. I would ask him this evening, but I'm thankful for him that despite challenges and even continuing of pandemic. His wife is honoring him and his family with a Father's Day event this evening. So,
All right.
but I will hope to recall this next week. And so my question is, you seem to have spoken about simply being with, and is that the most workable, do you think? Or, and I know different facilities are going to provoke different challenges or provide different challenges. But would saying such and such group or individual proposes to teach something, and if people show up?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's when I mentioned these programs we have on death row, we've created them over the years. But yes, you can do that. You can offer a course in whatever, and usually you will have an opportunity to teach that. Now, you brought up chaplains, and so we need to have a candid discussion about chaplains.
I said this, by the way, because I think that's the way this person, who's a United Methodist pastor, retired, has gotten in, but I may be mistaken. Thank you.
And that's usually the case. Chaplains are supposed to facilitate religious people in whatever they want to do, visit, teach, whatever. But you have to come to them with a specific program of what you want to do. They're not going to come up with any ideas. You have to have a specific program, be prepared to advocate for it. Now, having said that, chaplains work for the state. And it's been my experience, as Dan Berrigan and Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a little book together called The Chaplain Carries the Keys. And that's really true. The chaplain carries the keys. The chaplain is aligned with the warden, is aligned with the state. So that's who you're working with here. You have to remember that. So most of the guys don't have great relationships with chaplains. They don't trust them. That's not true of all of them. But they are part of the warp and woof of the prison that you have to work with. And that's your entry point, by and large, is the chaplain, someone who's in charge of religious activities. So use them, if you will, to get in there, and then do what you want to do once you get in there.
Thank you. And I'll just mention this, and because others may have some response or experience with yours, but there are friends of mine who are members, and in particular, there's a small ministry team of Beloved Community Church, which is about immigrant justice, and that's its title, but it largely is operating as a contact for the ICE facilities or at least the one in Gadsden, Alabama, Etowah County. And so I didn't mention earlier that there are persons who in the past have been allowed to actually get close enough to have telephone conversations with the detainees in Etowah. Not anything like that recently. And so but letters can go through, and some persons from Beloved Community are in correspondence. And also there's a group who goes occasionally, at least, and I guess we'll go tomorrow, because these are all men in Etowah and so many are fathers. They will simply, the group will simply vigil and witness outside. I don't think this one is planned to have prayers and songs and other things, as there have been at some holiday times. But that has been a it really has been helpful to several of my friends, in terms of feeling a connection that they've wanted, an action.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep asking all the questions, but I have another. You mentioned a book just now, the chaplain, what was it? The chaplain carries
The keys.
keys. And I wonder if you had any other really good book suggestions. You talked about Brian Stevenson, and I know his book, Just Mercy,
Right.
was well read, and we read it at Kirkwood as a part of our book club. And I'm curious of any other
Yeah,
suggestions.
a couple. One is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. We had Michelle and Brian here for a conference in Nashville about 5 years ago, along with Howard Zare. And Howard Zare, if you're not familiar with Howard, you should know him. He is the pioneer of restorative justice, not only in this country, but internationally. His book is called Changing Lenses. And what Howard talks about is we need to revision the whole criminal justice process and base it on restorative justice, not retributive justice, which is what we currently have. So read Howard's Changing Lenses, read Michelle's The New Jim Crow, and of course Brian's Just Mercy.
And if you possibly can, visit in Montgomery.
Yes, you should definitely go down to see the lynching. You know, I don't know what to say. It's just so powerful. Yeah, everybody should make a trip to Montgomery. Go down and visit EJI. If you let them know you're coming, they will provide someone who will talk to you individually about how everything started and what Brian's vision is, and they'll talk to your group about it, and then you can go on the tour. So yeah, and I've noticed that they're going to have to update it because they've discovered 2,000 more lynchings. So it's an ongoing.
And I think at least one of those is a family member of someone. And I guess I have too many various connections and I'm not remembering.
Yeah.
Member of First Congregational, member, a friend of Beloved, or the Firehouse Ministries shelter. Anyway, yes, but it is well worth experiencing.
And our annual meeting next year is in Montgomery, Alabama, for the Southeast Conference.
Well, we should build in a day to incorporate the lynching museum and the memorial. That really is a must. If we can't possibly go to Montgomery and not do that, that would be like that'd be a sin, is what that would be.
Totally agree, Joe. I haven't gotten there yet, but absolutely, that should be part of the conference.
Yeah.
Thank you all for the reminders, especially Kim, that as much as I know that next year's Southeast Conference annual meeting will be there.
Yeah, I did a lot of research for my book, Slouching Toward Tyranny, Mass Incarceration, Death Sentences, and Racism. Which is really taking that point of view from the bottom up of American history. So I looked at American history from the perspective of African American and the Native American. And that's what that is. That's their story. And doing that research, I read an awful lot. And I am well steeped in this. But when I went to that lynching museum, I learned a couple things I didn't know. And one of them haunts me to this day. There was a doctor in Montgomery. Now, this man, whose name I am repressing, actually has a statue built in his honor in New York City, who came to be considered as the pioneer in gynecology. And what he did is he would operate on slaves with no anesthesia. to explore the female organs and to see what made up, what would make his book, I guess, or history, make him the father of gynecology in the United States. That thing is the most, I just stood there and froze after I read that. I thought, oh my God, he did what? And the fact that, you know, if we're going to take statues down, that's a statue that needs to come down in New York City. You know, that is incredible. But, you know, you don't regard somebody as a human being. You can do anything you want to them. You can cut them open, you can electrocute them, whatever you want to do, you can do it. And that's what he did.
I can only give thanks that that statue is not in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yeah, exactly.
But it does also remind me that my world, small as it is in some respects, because it tends to be around the values of that, you know, are true for followers of Christ and what we've spoken about regarding justice, and but that the two other congregations of the UCC in Birmingham are actually where I think one or both of those persons I was recalling. One is Pilgrim, and the other is Covenant Community, and they have shared, persons there have shared some terrible experiences they've had, and at least one with a relative who was more recently discovered to have been.
Right.
Yeah.
This is just a point of information if anybody is interested in this. We've mentioned a lot of books, and including yours, Joe, and Kim mentioned that they could be ordered from Amazon. But I just want to throw out there that there are independent bookstores to support and that you can order online. Charis Books and More in Atlanta is a feminist bookstore. You can order any of these books. Deep commitment to justice, deep commitment to looking at the prison industrial complex and all of that. So it's charisbooksandmore.com, CHARIS, and just a suggestion that we can also order from places like that.
And Thank You Books in right, basically in the neighborhood of some of us in Birmingham. Thank You Books on Crestwood Boulevard, and it, yes, thank you for those reminders.
I thought I would share a story Michelle Alexandra shared with me, which I think illustrates part of the whole problem of the prison industrial complex. So Michelle was in Columbus, Ohio, and Barack Obama was elected president. So they had a big party in Columbus. And she remembered coming out of the steps of a downtown building, and it was dark. And she comes down the steps to the curb, and she looks over here, and here are 3 white cops with a black guy cuffing him on the curb. And she thought, I wonder what President Obama is going to be doing about things like this. And the answer became clear. Not much. Not much. At the end of my book, I looked at Obama's record on criminal justice, and it was not good at all. He did commute some people at the end, but there was so much more to be done. There were thousands of people who he could have commuted through the federal powers of commutation. And I think it's important to realize that the built-in bias in this country against people is enormous on class as well as race. And that's what is driving this system. And you can have a black president, you can have Joe Biden. If you're not aware of that and take steps to overcome it, it's going to keep driving. And that's where we're at with 2.2 million people locked up and almost 3,000 people executed since 1977. So we just have to remember we're up against a huge machine. And you may see your little point in your little part of it in Atlanta or Birmingham or wherever you are. But it's a huge machine throughout this entire country. And we have to revision it like Howard Zare talks about in Changing Lenses. We have to revision a whole new system where we actually bring the victim and offender together with a trained facilitator to work things out and not have a system that just sends people off to prison, but to actually try to restore people who've been harmed. That's what we should be doing in this work.
Well, you mentioned the presidency just now. I was thinking about this week, I'd read in the news about Joe Biden asking for, well, it said during his the campaign that he had talked about ending the federal death penalty. But then this week, it's been asked that it be used or reinstated for something. I guess not reinstated because we haven't gotten rid of it yet. But do you know?
Well, he's put a moratorium on it, federal executions. Now, some people may be trying to get that changed, but that's the last I heard. You may have noticed that Trump and William Barr executed like 13 people in 6 months. It was awful. They literally rushed one through 24 hours before Biden became president because they knew he would stop the execution once he became president. So yeah, it's not a good situation.
Well, I think if we are about to the very end of our time, and I know that you all join me in thanking Joe for joining us this morning and sharing so much with us and so much good information.
Well, thank all of y'all. I've really enjoyed it. It's good to see these faces.